the Great Flood. Since it's a bit of a shorter passage, last week I had mentioned that I was going to share a little bit about how I go about reading and interpreting Scripture, and I do this work whenever I start working on preparing sermons. It gives you a little bit of insight in terms of how I enter the text and how I let the text work on me. And so there's 5 basic things that I do, or 5 elements to what we would call my hermeneutics of Scripture. A hermeneutic is a way of seeing. It's a lens for how we read. So in some ways there are certain assumptions that I just go with. And then there are some methods to how I read. So one of the assumptions comes out of what we read last week, that we are created in the image of God. That says something about who we are as human beings. It also says something about who God is. And so beginning there already says this is a different kind of text. It's doing something different. Whenever we're reading as a person who's created in the image of God, reading about other people who are created in the image of God. So that's one starting point. The other, there are 2 arcs that I believe Scripture follows. One arc is towards justice and liberation. So for me, a primary verse in that is Micah 6:8, which asks the question, what does the Lord require? Any of you know this passage, this verse of Scripture? What does the Lord require of us?
To do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God.
To do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That's a hermeneutic, right? So all of Scripture is moving us towards justice, being merciful, and walking humbly with God. The other key narrative in that is the Exodus story. That is the sort of base story for all of Judaism. Really, most of their spirituality is oriented around that story. And therefore, as Christians who have followed in their path, that is central and core to our story as well. So as Scripture goes from the beginning to the end, it's leading us on this arc towards justice and liberation. So earlier passages of Scripture might feel or might read a little bit more violent and vengeful than later parts of Scripture. Does that match up with your experience? Right? So that's one element. The other arc is towards love. So very similar. Dr. Cornel West says that justice is what love looks like in public. To me, that's a really important phrase in my life, that love and justice are very, very connected. They're certainly connected in Scripture. And so this goes back to the being created in the image of God, because in 1 John, the apostle writes about how God is love. That is essentially his definition. And in the Eastern Church, Eastern Orthodox Church, their conception of God is a little bit different than the Western Church. In the Eastern Church, their understanding of God is more like energy, and I really resonate with that because love is energy, and so I really kind of like that construction. The other 2 things that I really pay attention to. One is an interpretive method called socio-rhetorical, and that basically is saying 2 things. One, all text, even sacred text, is written within a certain societal structure and culture. And so I have to pay attention to that, right? Many times, or at least what I was taught when I was younger, is I was taught that scripture was written for me in my time and my place. So when I sit down and read it, God is speaking directly to me. On the one hand, I agree with that. On the other hand, that's a really dangerous place to start. If you don't have some tools at your disposal to work with it, because I think I've talked about this before, but the story of Jacob and Esau, that's a really tricky one. Because if we put ourselves in the place of Jacob, then we can have a moral that says it's okay to lie, steal, and cheat in order to get what we want if we believe God is giving that to us, right? That's a hard way, a difficult way to interpret that passage. So it's really important to pay attention as much as possible to the context, the society, the people, the culture in which the text is originally written. Obviously, we can't know everything about that time and place, but that's an important place to start. Rhetoric is simply speech or writing that is intended to persuade us to something. And a lot of scripture is just doing that sort of thing. Primarily, it is trying to persuade us towards that arc of justice, mercy, humility, love, right? It's trying to persuade us that we want to continually try to align and realign ourselves with God's purposes, God's will. And then the other thing that I do, the last thing, these aren't, in sequential steps, but I always try to take the literal meaning first. That might seem counterintuitive from a progressive type of person, because a lot of literal interpretations have gotten Christians in trouble over time. But to look at the simplest and most literal meaning first helps avoid some of the dangerous traps of going immediately to the metaphor or what does this mean. And I'm going to actually give an example of that from the flood story a little bit. But if you skip over that first step of reading it literally, as close to the literal meaning as possible, if you skip that step, sometimes it takes you in places that are really, really inappropriate. Last week, remember I talked about the difference in the translation of the word ruah, the Hebrew word ruah. Ruah Elohim. Its literal meaning is a strong wind or a mighty wind. The NIV, the people that put together the NIV translation, because they are operating under a Trinitarian assumption, they just translate that as spirit. So they move beyond the literal meaning, and they do the interpretive work for us. Sometimes we trust those committees to do that, and that's a good thing to do, but we also have to be careful with that. So that's just a kind of a really quick overview, because if you're ever wondering when I'm talking about scripture, when I'm preaching, it's like, where is he getting that? That's a big piece of it, right? So that's just for all your edification, to get to know me a little bit more. So about this passage, I'll just point out a couple things that might be worth noting, and then take some questions, or to, just really kind of ask where you went with it. Again, this passage has a lot of parallels in other cultures at the time that this was